So you want a new pet. Congratulations! Your family is about to grow one heartbeat larger. But where are you going to start? If you're anything like me, finding a new pet can be exciting and overwhelming at the same time. There are so many options for where to get a pet, especially with the internet at our fingertips, and there are lots of opinions about them. This video is an introduction into some of those options. Disclaimer, I'm not an expert, I'm just a person who has a lot of pets and a passion for animal education. This is not a comprehensive guide, but hopefully it'll get you to start thinking about some options you may not have considered before. Let's get started. When getting a new pet, the first thing that comes to my mind is animal shelters. Shelters are sometimes government funded, sometimes privately owned, usually not-for-profit centers where, for whatever reason, people give up their pets to be adopted by somebody else. Adopting an animal from an animal shelter usually involves an application and some sort of fee to cover whatever medical expenses the animal shelter offered your animal to make sure it was healthy for its adoption. This is Quill, my normal ball python. I adopted him from the Pacific Northwest Herpetological Society, which is a nonprofit that, in addition to offering education services for the public about reptiles, also runs an adoption and fostering program. Although it might not be the traditional rescue that you think of when you think of animal shelters, the Herpetological Society partners with a bunch of humane societies in the area to make sure that when a reptile is surrendered, it actually goes to the people who are experts in reptiles instead of a shelter that might not have the capacity to provide the correct amount of care or the length of care that might be necessary for a reptile that is abandoned. Another common place to get animals is through rehoming. Rehoming is a term that people use when they get animals from people who don't want them anymore, usually through websites like Craigslist or Kijiji. Because the rehoming process is initiated by an individual giving up their animal, the process varies, and sometimes a rehoming fee is involved and sometimes it isn't. The condition of the animal and how much accurate information you get about the animal also varies from person to person. I've gotten several of my animals through the rehoming process. This is Penny, my dog. I got her from a family that said that they had an unexpected litter of puppies that they couldn't take care of. Looking back though, I'm not 100% sure if that was the truth, and that's one of the things that you have to keep in mind with rehoming. This is my cat, Turtle, and I got her from a girl who seemed to be in about her mid-20s, who said that she had just adopted a kitten. Thank you, Penny. Who said that she had just adopted a kitten and she wasn't prepared for the responsibilities that it entailed, so she was looking to rehome her cat. I'm not 100% sure where she got Turtle, but I'm pretty confident that if she hadn't found somebody to adopt her, Turtle would have ended up in an animal shelter. By rehoming her instead, we cut out the middleman of me paying animal shelter fees, and she got some money back to recoup on her losses. And that's why most people choose rehoming over shelters in the first place. I also got my 3 Egyptian spiny mice through the rehoming process. This is Anansi. I also have 2 other mice named Sif of the Golden Hair and Shoe, and I got them from a woman who said she was downsizing her colony. She said that she had accidentally put a male and a female mouse together, and so she ended up with too many mice. I argue that animal shelters and rehoming have something in common. They can kind of both be considered rescues. I know what you're thinking, rehoming animals is different from rescuing them. But hear me out. Animals that end up in shelters or being rehomed do so for pretty identical reasons. There are many reasons why people rehome their animals, just like there are many reasons why animals end up in shelters. This can include time, money, housing, major lifestyle changes. The list is pretty endless. Also, animals that are in shelters or being rehomed already exist, regardless of your interaction with them. Whether you choose to adopt them or not, these animals are already alive and in need, which brings me to breeders. There are a couple different kinds of breeders: hobby breeders and small business breeders. Hobby breeders are usually one person who decides that this is their time, they're going to breed animals. They get a couple of animals together, see what happens, and try to make a few bucks. Some hobby breeders have small collections with just a few animals, and some have large collections and a high volume of breeding animals. Hobby breeders also have varying standards of care for their animals, ranging from neglectful to minimum to pretty extraordinary. Hobby breeders also have varying levels of transparency about their animals and their level of care. Some provide very little or unreliable information, while others are extremely open. It really depends on the person. Several of my animals come from hobby breeders. To respect their privacy, I won't be sharing any names, but I will tell you a little bit about how I got them. This is Puck, my crested gecko. I got him from a local hobbyist who I connected with through a Facebook group. We had some back and forth, I researched her Instagram page, and we met up so I could buy a new hatchling, and that was Puck. Tabitha, my gargoyle gecko, came to me through a breeder I met through Craigslist. He was advertising a recent clutch. We texted back and forth, and when we met up, it was very clear that he took his animal care very seriously. I could tell from the way his gargoyles were housed, and also from the detailed records that he kept. This is Mr. Banks, my extremely grumpy African pygmy hedgehog. I found him on Craigslist, and I assumed that it was another rehoming situation until I got to talking with his human, and I found out that she was a hobby breeder. Mr. Banks was the last of her most recent litter that was available. Business breeders, on the other hand, are breeders who are licensed to sell their animals to the public. This process involves a lot of paperwork, fees, and legally enforced standards for the breeder. Many small business breeders start as hobby breeders, and some sell directly to stores instead of individuals. We'll get to that later. I've also purchased some animals through small business breeders. I got Tofu Todd, my axolotl, from Ivy's Axolotls at the Pacific Northwest Reptile Expo. It's run by 1 or 2 people who are responsible for breeding, marketing, and selling their animals. I picked up Millicent, my giant desert millipede, from a small business breeder whose name I'm so sorry, I totally forgot. I met him at a New England Reptile Expo. He was selling all sorts of creepy crawlies. This is Boss Hefe. I'm not going to keep him out because he is my Mexican black king snake. I ordered him through Morph Market from Motor City Reptiles. It was the first and only time that I had an animal mailed to me, but I wanted a Mexican black king snake, and finding them in a rescue situation is extremely improbable. I had been looking for one at a couple of different reptile expos, but I hadn't found the exact type that I wanted, so I looked online. It felt weird to ship a creature, but it isn't any different from how stores stock their inventory. Now, let's talk about stores. Just like breeders, there are 2 different types of stores: independent stores and chain stores. Independent stores are your local pet shop that typically purchases animals from local breeders to sell to the public. These are big stores like Petco and PetSmart that source their animals from large breeding companies like Reptiles by Mac that do not sell directly to the public. Instead, these animals are typically purchased at low prices in bulk and then resold at a big profit margin in store. Independent and chain stores both sometimes source their animals from the wild. Whether an animal is wild caught is important to know because animals taken from the wild not only usually have health concerns, but also impact the wild population of the animal, putting the species at risk. Stores are typically open about whether an animal is captive bred or wild caught, but it's a good policy to always ask to make sure before making your purchase. I purchased my yellow-banded poison dart frogs, Fee, Fo, and Fum from an independent store called Major League Exotic Pets. The reason why I categorize them under independent store instead of small business breeder is because they have an actual physical storefront and they don't produce all their animals. They source from outside breeders. I've also bought a pet from a large chain store. Tam Lin is my beta fish, who's almost 3 years old now, and I impulse bought him from Petco, where he was kept in a tiny deli cup. I hear a lot about people saying that they want to save animals from pet stores, and while this is not what I was doing, it is something that I want to talk about. Earlier I mentioned that I consider shelters and rehoming to both be forms of rescue because the animals already exist. They are alive regardless of your decision to adopt them or not. The same isn't true of breeders and stores, however. When you purchase an animal from somebody who is actively breeding them to be sold, your purchase directly funds the animal industry. Your money goes into the pockets of the store or the breeder, which encourages them to continue breeding more and more animals. If no one bought from breeders or stores, they would inevitably stop breeding and go out of business. Depending on the practices of the breeder or store, which can vary widely, this isn't inherently a bad thing. If a breeder or store treats their animals well and educates the buyer on proper care, you may even want to support their business. If an animal is hard to find and in high demand, you may want to use your money to encourage increasing the population in captivity. It's difficult to say if it's better to get your animal from one place over another, because there are so many factors that go into finding a new animal. As a rule, if there's an animal in need, I would always encourage rescuing it before purchasing one from a breeder or a store. There are completely justifiable reasons for why somebody might choose otherwise. Morality isn't black and white, and it varies person to person. I am not in the business of imposing my morality on anybody else. The best thing to do is to educate yourself about what options are available, and to research that wherever you're getting your animal aligns with your individual morals.